My name is Moyo Okediji, and I am professor of African and African Diaspora Arts at the University of Texas, Austin. And I am the curator of this exhibition titled WAKATI, Time Shapes African Art. The idea of WAKATI is to situate African art in the context of time and draw the relationship between time and space in African art. And what we have done in this exhibition is to put together works that are historical, or what some people describe as traditional, with works that are contemporary, to show the transition of time and how it has shaped the passage of art in Africa. It is actually quite difficult to speak of African art. It is probably much more appropriate to speak of art in Africa. The difference is significant in the sense that when we say African art, it gives the impression that the geography of Africa itself has produced works that are specific to that continent and cannot be found in any other continent. But when you actually think about the location of Africa itself, it is such a centralized continent that is a gateway to Europe, to Asia, and to the Americas. Between the coast of North Africa and Europe, at some point there is only 8 miles separating the two continents. And the 8 miles has not posed too much of a barrier for people, and they have been crossing over for centuries. And as people move around, of course, they also move images and cultures around. So there is, and there has been, a very strong connection between the art of Africa and of Europe. And until the Suez Canal was constructed in the middle of the 19th century, there was really no disconnection between Africa and the Middle East. People had been crossing by land for thousands of centuries. So the idea of an African art itself becomes problematic in the sense that the continent has been influenced by outside cultures, just as it has also influenced outside cultures. So what we have done in this exhibition is to show what may be regarded as works that you could describe as traditional, indigenous, plus works that could be much more specifically situated within global discourse of the contemporary, of urban cultures, and some would even say modernity. Let's begin by taking a look at some of the objects in the exhibition. The exhibition is constructed in such a way that the emphasis is on the hand of the artist. What I mean by that is that in many exhibitions of African cultures, the emphasis has been more on what could be described as the ethnicity, or what some people describe as tribes, and also perhaps in the context of religion. But no tribe produces art. Artists make art. And to make art, an artist has to learn the craft of making art. There is no degree of religiosity that can produce art. No priest can simply, with the calling of priesthood, make art. One has to go to school to learn how to manipulate form, how to build images, how to transform materials from the raw, from the ordinary to the extraordinary. And one of the challenges that African artists have very ably faced in time is the concept of fantasy, the concept of play, the concept of being able to bring materials that seem almost incongruent together in ways that that bring out the sense of the essence of these materials and connect them, and in ways that also speak to the interrelatedness of materials. In other words, all materials can work together. It depends on the skill of the artist who is bringing these materials together. And the challenge that has faced many artists from Africa is to be able to discover this spirit behind the materials in such a way that these materials can be brought together in ways that transform the material, and very importantly, in ways that show the essence of playfulness, the essence of fantasy, the essence of having power over the material itself. And when we take a look at this object that has been used as an introductory centerpiece, the challenge for the artist is to bring together wood, to bring together seeds, to bring together shells and ropes and fibers and pigment to create this awe-inspiring piece that immediately catches the attention of the viewer. And for me, one of the fascinating things about African figurative work, such as this, is the way in which it shows a moment of arrestation, a moment in which time seems frozen. It's a powerful moment when the African artist is able to bring in the idea of the still, something that is motionless, and at the same time be able to convey movement, be able to convey music, be able to convey poetry with the arrangement of the several parts of the composition. As you will discover in a lot of these pieces and in many African cultures, the emphasis is on bringing together what you could refer to as similar parts, in being able to fashion the works in such a way that if, for instance, one follows the movement of these composition, one sees a zigzag kind of formation that begins from the top and moves down to the bottom. So that rhythm itself, the rhythm comes from music, which enables the artist to impart this sense of choreography, this sense of poesy into the essence of the composition. So what we are looking at is not just simply an object that is for religious purposes. What we are encountering is a demonstration of the ability of the artist to transform a simple piece of wood and materials that are found in the environment into an amazing and extraordinary statement. If we continue into the composition, we will find, into the gallery, we will find a variety of objects that more or less continue with that theme, the theme of the transformation of materials. But in each work from various parts of Africa, one finds also unique and stylistic as well as spatial differences. For instance, this work that we are looking at is by a known African artist. His name is Dada Arowogun. Others would call him Areogun, Dada Areogun. And what he is describing is a specific historical moment in the lives of his people. It is a door, but as the European artist René Magritte said in his 1928 composition, The Treachery of Images, it is not a door. René Magritte spoke of this painting and has a pipe there and says, this is not a pipe. This is not a door. It is an excuse for exploring the history of these people. Let's, for instance, take a look at some of the registers in the composition. The entire composition is divided into two parts. Each part is subdivided into 5 registers. And what the artist is depicting in this composition is the moment in which Westerners entered into that moment when Westerners entered into Yoruba country and what was transpiring at that moment. It was, for these people, a very chaotic moment. It was a moment when they were involved in their own civil war. And what the artist has shown in this piece is the culture as it was disintegrating, the culture when warriors moved into that society. At the top of the register here, we find soldiers who are depicted in their uniforms, and they are carrying rifles or Dane guns. The Danes had the Europeans had just brought firearms into this culture, and immediately they began to use firearms in these battles. And we could see foot soldiers depicted at the very top, and right below it we see a horse rider, a general, and only generals at that time rode horses, and the general has next to him a foot soldier carrying a spear. And if we again move to that part of the composition, you'll see an individual who is in the nude. The individual is tied to the horse of the general. That, of course, depicts someone who has been captured, a war captive, and is a male war captive, and usually they ended up in the transatlantic slavery market. One of the ways through which the artist is able to depict the identities of the characters is in terms of the way they are dressed or not dressed. For instance, there is this woman who is totally in the nude, and on both sides of her we have soldiers also carrying rifles, and they hold her on both sides, more or less as a way of demonstrating that she has been captured and she is now a slave. But we also see details that signify the original identity of this woman as someone from a royal origin or a royal background, in terms of the expensive beads around her waist as well as around her necks. And the register directly below that is quite a significant and interesting register, in that it depicts the arrival of the European into the culture, the European who is coming on a motorcycle or a bicycle in some cases, and the European is depicted smoking a pipe and has an attendant who is holding his pipe, as well as with the other hand he is holding a fan. But let me just speak briefly about the bottom register so that we can move to another object. It simply shows a village scene in which women with children tied to their backs pounding grains in a mortar. And it also shows a gentleman seated on a chair who is being presented with food. The implication of this is to memorialize that moment of war in which even cities developed or emerged from the battles. And the battlefronts more or less become a place also of commerce and of social interaction beyond warfare itself. Again, if we move to this work that becomes some kind of interplay between two-dimensional and three-dimensional form, we see the way in which the artist is using fibers to generate a sense of rhythm throughout the body of the composition. This is a theme that we will see right through the entire work, the way in which artists infuse visual forms in repetitive ways to show a sense of movement from one part, from the vertical and also the horizontal, and as well as the diagonal, and also with the use of contrast of colors that harmonize, colors that are so bold that they are very legible against their backgrounds. The same theme we find here, a simple repetition with sufficient variety to keep the interest of the viewer right through. There is suggestions of calligraphic themes, because in many ways this could actually be read in terms of numbers. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and we also see the 1, 2, 3 repeated in the form of lines as well as in the form of dots. So the reading refers to mathematics, it refers to poetry, it refers to music, just as we find in the other pieces. And at the same time, it is with the use of extremely simple materials, just strip woven cotton with dye, with just natural dyes from the back. The artist who made that panel, the double panel that we just saw, gave birth to an incredible sculptor by the name of Bamidele Arowogu. So what we see, the son using the style of the father to produce this cylindrical shape that reads continuously round the body of the composition. It is the same theme that both artists are exploring. Again, the same theme of warfare, the same theme of fragmentation, the same theme of transition from a moment of peace to a moment of conflict. The details that we find in these works in many ways would refer to some of the details that we saw on the panel, the two-sided or the double panel that we examined earlier on. In this section, we have displayed objects that are actually embodied, objects that are worn, objects that are used in performance. In this instance, those objects have now crossed what you may describe as an aesthetic border from Africa to the West. And in the process of doing that, they have also attained new, new forms, new identities. And the exhibition is able to bring many and different cultures that you probably would not find in Africa together. They are now brought together into this show as neighbors, neighbors that, that seem to be performing a different kind of aesthetic in this new setting. As I said earlier on, the work is embodied in the sense that they are actually worn on the body of performers and used in performances. So that in the original displays of these works, of these art forms, they would not be displayed as still objects. They would never be seen still. They are brought out on special occasions and performed in the community, in streets, and people would come and watch them. The other times in the year, they are kept in special places where nobody would have access to them. So the only time you actually will see these objects would be when the objects are worn and used in performance. And the performances are always in the context of music, of chanting, of celebration, of food, of eating, of lavish gifting, because usually they are performed after the harvest, when the harvest has been done and the new crops have been sown. They are not yet grown up, and the crops are being encouraged to grow. Since these cultures play on the interrelatedness of things, people believe that the performances of many of these works would contribute to the agricultural growth, to the sense of regeneration, to also a sense of timelessness, a sense in which there is continuity, a sense in which death itself is banished. In other words, these are cultures that no longer believe in the idea of death. And it is with some of these objects that they are able to attain that sense of deathlessness, in the sense that when the crop is harvested, that is some kind of symbolic death of the crop. But when the crop is harvested, the land again is resown so that new things generate. The same thing is applicable to the human body. When the body gets old, the body necessarily must be shed. But the spirit itself never dies. The spirit goes into the other world and returns regenerated, just like the crops returns as babies, so that there's a necessary connection between the old and the babies, because it is the old that become babies, just like the babies will grow to become old. So that sense of the cycle, of the cyclic, is what a lot of these works celebrate. Some of the figurative pieces here, again, we see the principles of playfulness, of fantasy that we have seen in some of the other pieces that we've witnessed. The sense in which the artist feels free to play with the material, to also bring out what the artist considers the essence of the material. Necessarily, the wood has to be killed before a carving is made out of the wood. But when the wood is killed, a new form emerges from that piece of wood. So that sense of continuity is also very important toward the understanding of these forms. And the forms that we see here, the central forms, are female forms. It is interesting that in many parts of Africa, I would say in virtually all parts of Africa, the carving that is in the indigenous traditions, the carving of wood and the making of three-dimensional works is usually the prerogative or the duties of the men, even though these central forms are descriptions of female forms. And so it becomes more or less ways through which men celebrate femininity, the things that men associate with the female body, in ways that also accentuate the essence of regeneration. Because in many African cultures, the woman is regarded as the most important connection between spiritual forces, between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And in many of these cultures, the woman is described as a bird. The bird is clearly the only animal that can walk, that can fly, and can swim. And that essence of just total mobility, the essence of being unstoppable, is one of the characteristics of womanhood. And the mystery that the woman has to be able to move so fluidly through all of these strange terrains to bring children from the other world into this world becomes quite important. We will have to move a little quickly through the gallery so that we can cover some of the other important forms. throughout this exhibition, you'll see the way in which artists explore ideas of exaggeration, of subtraction, of emphasizing certain parts of the body, of making certain parts of the body tiny. And if we, for instance, look at this work, we'll see that the head is about a third of the entire body. And the idea is to signify the importance of the head in this culture. You could remove the hand, you could remove the legs, and the body still continues to live. But you cannot remove the head. And that is why that head becomes the basic measurement of the entire body in terms of relative size, in terms of the importance. This work brings in a different dimension to African expressive culture, in the sense that it is photography. It is photography that demonstrates the advent of modernity into African culture, the advent of new technology. Yet the artist Akinyi Wadende uses the technology to represent ideas that are timeless in many African cultures. This woman, a farmer, is shown with dogs and with chicken and her little shed that she has constructed for these animals. She would build the shed by herself with the help of other women. Women in this culture that Wadende lives in, women build the houses. This, of course, is some kind of shed specifically constructed for these animals. If it were a building made for people, we will have this basic skeletal wooden structure, and then the women would apply clay to finish it up. This painting is by the artist Orishagbemi Arigba Buwo, who has worked with indigenous African artists and who has learned to use materials that are organic and natural to the cultures. So the artist is essentially using soil. She worked with the Akire artists. The Akire artists are painters, indigenous women painters in Africa, and all they do is paint on the walls of their shrines using indigenous materials. And the painting that is next to the work by Arigba Buwo is by the artist Tinomi Afilaka, who is an Akire artist who traditionally would use soil to paint. But there was a series of workshops in which she participated in 2003, 2004. And during the workshop, art materials from the West, especially acrylic, was brought to the painter Tinomi Afilaka. And she was able to use the same techniques that she uses in the indigenous cultures to transform the materials. What she does essentially is to write letters to the divinities. And she has invented her own scripts of writing. Each character means something. For instance, if we look at the top of this painting, we would see hills. These are depictions of hills, but they are hills that can be climbed. Sometimes the hills cannot be climbed, and these are symbols of problems, of challenges that people face. In some instances, you will find these roundish figures with sticks coming down from them. All of these actually represent people. The diversity that we find in people. People are different. They are of all types, and she represents them differently throughout the composition. We have properties, we have boards, and so on and so forth. We have combs, and the entire thing she can read easily to signify specific ideas. And now, at the bottom, we find here the beginning of works by the artist Akirash. Akirash belongs to a different generation of artists who are reading politics into their works. And he comes from Nigeria, that at the moment is facing military crisis. We now have terrorism, more or less in the northern part of Nigeria. And there is this battle between the terrorists and the Nigerian army. And recently, there was the kidnapping of 200 girls from the country that Akirash comes from. And we find these references to military conflicts in his work. But again, despite the political references in his work, there is always also the sense of wonder, the sense of fantasy, the sense of play, and the attempt to construct refuges or places of comfort away from some of these zones of conflict. And we see these incredible architectural construction around the theme of fantasy. At the same time, one always sees the reference to conflict in terms of the military headgear. The work is quite accessible and draws you into it, enables you to interact with it, and even sometimes to see yourself reflected in the work in the form of the mirror, mirror that also has been transformed in this composition. So the roundness is quite comforting, but the details is sometimes strikingly and dramatically violent when we see these military helmets in the composition. But it is not just a reference to Nigeria specifically, it's also a reference to some of the crises that we are facing now in this era of terrorism. But he seems to have created some kind of place of comfort, a zone in which one might be able to find a bit of refuge, using art as a means, as a catalyst. In this painting by Tola Wewe, we again see the continuity of the emphasis on the head as the most important aspect of the body. And the play with colors, the play with lines and patterns and rhythm and music, and also the celebration of the female body by a male artist. If we were to move to this work, again, that sense of these are not knives. You at first, you'll be tempted to see them as just knives, but in fact, you will see that the artist does not have to go to the pain of making these very dramatic, playful, and quite forms of fantasy if all the artist wanted to do was to produce lines. That sense of fantasy, the sense of play with forms, the sense of playing with materials, you will also find in this representation of labor pains by Orishagbemi Arigbabuwo. The female body is more or less dissolved into this elaborate construction of lines and shapes and colors that that are derived from the natural environment, just simple soils. If we could move to the work of the sculptor Denenge. Denenge sees herself as a space sculptor. In other words, she goes into a space and transforms that space into an avenue, into an arena of sheer fantasy, of play. She describes her work as Afrofuturism. In other words, she is imagining the future at the moment, but beyond that, she is bringing together the past, the present, and the future into a seamless and organic composition in which three-dimensional figures interact with shadows and with objects that reference indigenous implements and objects that reference growth as trees, but in ways that necessarily remove the original references and turns everything into metaphors. She is also interacting with the Akire painters, the painters who use art as healing, because essentially the basis of her own work is healing. And there are these references to leaves. The leaves are herbs, herbs that are also used in the cult of Osanyi. Osanyi is the divinity of healing. In many instances, we see elements of glitters that she brings into the composition, because her work is also a celebration of light. And to make light effective, she necessarily uses a black backdrop. The way in which black functions in her work is as the essence of all colors, rather than as the absence of colors, because the work comes from the idea of colors coming from fire. And when fire is burning, it displays all the colors. And finally, when the fire dies, it turns into ashes, which is white.